I'm starting a new life, and it's quite exciting for me to invite a composer from San Francisco, California, the place where I was myself last summer, and I now can't believe that I'm connecting with somebody across the ocean. So I'm connecting Sam now. Sam, greetings from St. Petersburg, from 10 time zones.
Yes, nice to see
Well,
you. Greetings from the wild, wild west.
yes, the only nice thing that the quarantine brings is that one can connect across the globe through virtual talks.
Yeah, indeed. It's an interesting paradox, isn't it? It's
Mm-hmm.
we're so isolated from one another, but in a strange way, I feel very close to many people in my life for whom I don't, typically see on a weekly basis or something like this. So it's I'm trying to find the silver linings, shall we say.
Can I ask briefly? Can you walk in the city or in the surroundings where you live
Yes,
at the moment?
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So my wife and I, we don't actually live in San Francisco. We're in
Mm-hmm.
Berkeley on the other side of the bay. And we're very lucky because there are all kinds of parks where we can go and walk around and run around and get exercise and, make sure we're getting enough oxygen. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, let's start. I can't avoid this question. How have you decided to become a composer, especially considering that you are coming from a family of a composer too?
Right. Yeah. Sure. It's I suppose a psychological slash anthropological question. It was actually quite of a roundabout path for me. I think many people who I meet might assume that I started quite early composing music. Given that I'm from a very artistic family, um, but in fact, the first piece I wrote was not until senior year of college. When I was 20 or 21 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And how I arrived there was through, I think, a very long period of artistic wandering. I started off uh, playing classical piano as a young kid. Like I mentioned already, I grew up in Berkeley, California, which is a wonderful place to be a young musician. The Bay
Mm-hmm.
Area is not so much a place that artists in their early career necessarily flock to. It's not like New York or
Mm-hmm.
Chicago or LA in that sense. But to be a young musician there, and when I say young, I mean like, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. It's fantastic, and that's because there are all kinds of wonderful organizations and schools. And so I went to a kind of educational startup school called the Crowden School, which was started in 1983 by a kind of take no prisoners iconoclastic Scottish woman who was a violinist named Anne Crowden. And she, along with some of her friends, rented out the basement of a church at the Graduate Theological Union, which is right next to UC Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
And they got about 15 students to come and to participate in this educational experiment. And the qualifying aspect of the school was that we all played string instruments each morning for 2 hours. And uh, and and so as a young person, I was already like very deep into not just piano, but also I played contrabass as well. And so I was surrounded by the music of um, Bach and Vivaldi and
Mm-hmm.
Dvorak, and like all the great masters of the Western canon. Um, and so that was a very important part of my upbringing. And then, as one is wont to do when they're, in their teens, I decided that I would try my hand at improvising and playing jazz. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, I took my skills as a classical bass player and kind of threw myself at the community of jazz musicians and improvising musicians in the Bay Area. and had a very different kind of educational experience, you know, whereas studying classical piano was very much this like process of receiving knowledge from my teacher who had received knowledge from their teacher, so on and so forth, in a very kind of tight way, learning how to improvise and learning jazz was very much a kind of non-linear process, you know, like playing with a bunch of different random people who I didn't necessarily know, taking gigs off of Craigslist. Yeah, I formed a part of my musical personality, which is, I think is still really important to the way I think about music. And then I went to college at Stanford. I wasn't entirely sure that music was a path that I wanted to pursue at that point. So I decidedly did not apply to conservatories. And while at Stanford, I studied composition, but I also spent quite a lot of time at an institution called CCRMA, CCRMA, which stands for the Computer Center and Research, Computer Center for Research in Music and Acoustics. That's the one. So you can think of it kind of like the IRCAM of California, an institution where music and technology and psychology and engineering kind of intersect in interesting ways. And it was after taking some courses there where I was thinking more analytically about sound and structure that I decided composing was kind of the best way to weave together these three very different ways of making music and thinking about music, but also like the three different ways of participating socially in different types of like musical organisms and organizations. So yes, it was a very kind of long and roundabout journey, but it was a difficult decision for me to arrive at, having you know, a father who's very well known, and you know, it was, I think that when I finally made the decision, like today, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to composing music. It was you know, it was a daunting moment in my life, but yeah, I haven't really turned back since.
Do you think, in your experience, does Stanford and Yale offer the good networking in your area that you can use afterwards, maybe connections with people, with ensembles, or is it more of the intellectual hub where you get new ideas but not useful for future networking in music?
Yeah, well, you know, as an undergrad, I wasn't really thinking about music in a professional sense, you know, which is actually kind of a beautiful thing. Like when I was there, I was just encountering Stockhausen's music for the first time, and it was a kind of like pure intellectual bubble in that sense. The other thing I should say about Stanford is that it's like geographically very removed from San Francisco, and so there isn't the same kind of like dialogue and connection between the institution and like the closest metropolitan hub where music is performed and consumed, like there was at Yale with New York City. And so, yeah, I would say for my master's program when I was in New Haven, there were a lot more opportunities to connect with musicians, particularly in New York. But also, you know, the School of Music at Yale is a professional school. It's a conservatory. It's where people go to hone their crafts, and then the idea is that you go out in the world and you know, you're like an active musician, engaging with audiences. And it's not to say that Stanford wasn't necessarily that, but it's a department of music, so the focus was much more on you know, theory, musicology, etc. And in fact, my degree, my undergraduate degree, was not in composition. It was in music. I have a bachelor in the arts, not a bachelor in music. So the kind of professional angles were very different at the two institutions.
This angle of acoustics and technology, do you think that a modern musician and composer would be at a disadvantage if he doesn't know this side? Or do you think one can still go through more conservative path and become a very well-established modern composer, if we consider the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on how you define like success as a composer. You know, if success is defined by how many orchestras are playing your music, which I think is like a very conventional model of judging someone's like stature as a composer, then absolutely you don't need to know anything about like signal processing or anything. You can write for, you know, instruments that are hundreds of years old and for a kind of social structure of performance that's also like pretty old as well. But you know, there's so many different ways that people are getting their music out into the world, and I think particularly here in the States, and I mean certainly in other parts of the world as well. But you know, I've only really lived in America, so I feel like I'm only qualified to talk about how it is here. But composers have, I think, found ways to be very imaginative about constructing their own ensembles and finding ways to communicate with audiences that don't necessarily require like a massive institution. And yeah, a lot of those particular kinds of ensembles, you know, involve different types of music making that wouldn't necessarily like be housed appropriately in, say, like a symphony orchestra. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm kind of answering a different question that you didn't really ask me, but I suppose
I was planning to ask this as well, like the connection to big institutions. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I suppose it doesn't hurt, you know, to know a little bit about this side of music making, and it's been, I think, a lot of the work of, you know, contemporary composers. But yeah, I don't think it's really a necessity. In fact, there are a lot of composers whom I admire very much, who I think clearly were just like, that I'm not good at that, and I'm not going to even bother with that, and I'm just going to focus on, you know, what really, you know, matters to me, and that may be acoustic music. You know, like Thomas Addis is a perfect example of someone. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't think he's ever at any point in his career, you know, pressed a button, so to speak. Everything is acoustic, and the music is, you know, wild and vivacious, and you know, in a conventional sense, he's incredibly successful.
Well, you started this question that I wanted to touch upon. On one hand, you've been commissioned by big institutions, like really big ones, Chicago Symphony, San Francisco Symphony. But on the other hand, you've curated the pieces, and you've been involved with ensembles that are doing their own work and choose unconventional venues. And I was wondering, what is the trend in modern music? Is it to try to find its way as a starting piece for big orchestral programs, or maybe now, especially in the States, orchestra, but in the museums, like the program that you've done with the Chicago Symphony. So basically, what is the area that modern music is likely to inhabit?
Right. You cut out for a little bit, so I just want to make sure that I fully understand your question. You're asking.
Yes. I saw that there was a signal. So on the one hand,
right,
a composer could be commissioned by a big institution, but on the other hand, there are many new venues and many pathways, and maybe collaborations with smaller ensembles that you are also involved in. And I'm wondering whether what is the trend that the music would take, kind of go and attach itself to big institutions, or develop independently in parallel?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it really depends on the type of artist you are. You know, I know many incredible composers whose goal is to form, you know, an ensemble, a small ensemble, and to write for that one ensemble over and over again, and to develop their own audience, and you know, to create their own record label, and to do everything in a kind of DIY, do it yourself
Mm-hmm.
type of format. And then again, there are also a lot of composers who uh, want to write for the orchestra. You know, composers for whom that particular medium is the best possible way for them to express certain ideas. Um, I think, you know, with respect to how uh, composers who kind of exist in the more kind of like DIY framework, how they can interface and collaborate with orchestras, I think is really a question for orchestras themselves, and how they can be more accommodating to find different ways to amplify as many voices as possible in the music community, and to amplify voices of composers who don't want to write for like 100 people on a stage. Um, and so you see a lot of orchestras, you know, creating new music series. Like the LA Phil, of course, has Green Umbrella, where most of the concerts are really like, you know, meant to to showcase works that are more of like a chamber size. Of course, the Chicago Symphony has Music Now, and in some instances, I think orchestras are thinking of themselves more as like museums where the production of a piece doesn't necessarily even require a subset of their own musicians. Like, I think one amazing thing that the Los Angeles Philharmonic is doing is this yearly noon to midnight new music marathon, where of course some of the LA Philharmonic musicians will perform slightly larger works, but the the orchestra is like literally just inviting small ensembles from all around the country to come and do their thing. And it's, you know, it's a wonderful thing that they're doing, that they're able to present different compositional voices without necessarily needing the kind of like orchestral like apparatus machine to put those types of pieces on the stage. But it's complicated, you know. And orchestras, I think, are still trying to find ways to best do this, because some music just really doesn't even belong in that type of space. You know? So, yeah.
You've been curating the Music Now series for 3 years with Elizabeth Agonic, and I wonder, did you do this amplifying work yourself, or or did you commission new pieces? How did you choose who would be part of the concerts?
Right. Yeah. It's a great question, and that's also a very complex kind of process. I think that there's at least to me, my kind of naive idea of what curating was before I started to really do it was to like point out a piece and then magically it would appear on a stage. And obviously, I mean, there's so many considerations to think about, like, you know, obviously like logistical things, but of course you also really want to be kind of like non-denominational or ecumenical about your decisions, since there's so many different types of music being made right now in America and across the globe, to kind of focus on one specific cloister, you know, that's not particularly a good idea. But also, like, with the musicians and with the organization and the people who you're collaborating with, it's really important to listen to them as well, and to understand like what they want to perform, and to listen to the city, for example, of Chicago, and to really make sure that that you're that you're listening to the desires of people in the community. So yeah, it's a very complex but fascinating process, and I really quite enjoy curating. And to answer your other question about Chicago specifically, we did, of course, a lot of repeat performances of existing contemporary works, but we did also commission quite a few pieces. Mm-hmm. We did a festival of Chicago composers, and we commissioned a young composer named Catherine Young, who's kind of an improvising bassoonist and composer. She writes really wild music, and it was amazing to get a piece from her. And we also commissioned Manual Cinema, which is a Chicago-based shadow puppet company. That was a lot of fun. And then I think it was the following season, or maybe 2 seasons later, we commissioned a really big piece from Amy Beth Kirsten, who's a composer. She was born in Chicago and she lives now in New Haven. So that was also a lot of fun, like being part of the process of selecting a composer and like helping a piece come to life. It was honestly, like, it brought me more joy than seeing my own music like evolve and finally get onto the stage. There was something like, I mean, I'm not a fart, but I imagine it's like the same kind of feeling of like, like watching something gradually develop and then have a life.
I was struck by the performance that is made of this music series, which is an audio visual architectural promenade. And I'm asking this because now, after the quarantine, people are thinking that such kinds may be the future, because you are working at a distance from others and you are not set in one place. So could you describe whether you think that the pieces where you are promenading while listening to music could be a future of music as we see it after the current situation?
Yeah, well, so the way that concert worked for your viewers is that we collaborated with the Art Institute of Chicago, and we selected 3 different spaces in the museum, and we had 3 different small sets of music. So 2 which we repeated, and then 1 which ended the evening. So in the Sculpture Garden, we did some harpsichord pieces by the great California composer Lou Harrison. What else did we do there? Was it just that? And then in front of the Chagall windows, we had a piece by Caroline Shaw and then Ruth Crawford Seeger's string quartet. And then everyone moved into another space where we had an electroacoustic percussion piece by a wonderful composer from Brooklyn named Christopher Cerrone. And it wasn't really a socially distanced event. There were like large flocks of people moving together. It wasn't a kind of individual experience in that sense. But I suppose, I mean, yeah, I suppose it could be a thing in the future. I think I just read something about museums reopening that they're going to have time limits on like certain artistic pieces, and you can only be in clusters of like 3 or 4 or something for a minute or so. And I mean, I suppose there could be, some kind of peripatetic event where there are, small groups of musicians performing. But yeah, I mean, the thing about music, which is different than visual art, is that it's a durational, media. It's a durational art form, and it really requires a certain kind of like intense focus and patience to really
and standing in one place, like not moving into different locations.
Yeah.
And to finish off this talk about the Chicago Symphony, could you describe your own work performed at the finale of the series? Your chamber concerto was performed by Karen Agomio, and the
right.
It stopped again. Could you describe the collaboration with him and how you felt at the end of this series?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that was the very last project that I did with Chicago, and it was the capstone event of the 20th anniversary of Music Now, which is the contemporary music series. And it was a wonderful event. We did it in the main hall, not in the Harris Theater, where most of the shows were produced. And we had a new piece by Elizabeth Ogonek, who's the co-conspirator, and a piece by a wonderful Icelandic composer who I'm sure you've heard of, Anna
Anna Thorvaldsdottir.
Thorvaldsdottir.
Yeah.
And a piece called Related Rocks by Magnus Lindberg. And yeah, I had the incredible privilege of working with Karen Gomio, fantastic violinist, and Esa-Pekka Salonen. And yeah, I mean, to this day, I think that might be like my musical highlight thus far. You know, working with Esa-Pekka is amazing because he's a composer himself, you know, like he totally gets it. He understands the like kind of terrifying psychological process that one goes through getting their music onto the stage for the first time. Like he knows what it's like to be in your studio for 6 months, very, very privately engaging with all these abstract ideas, and then to all of a sudden, like in the course of less than a week, just like put all this stuff in front of, you know, 1,000, 1,500 people, whatever. And so having him as a kind of ally in that process is, you know, amazing. But also he's such a cool character, you know. I mean, it's like that Finnish coolness. It was wonderful to be around. And, you know, he doesn't freak out like some conductors, you know, he's just like totally cool as a cucumber. And I think it really put me at ease, and I think Karen really enjoyed working with him as well. And then of course working with Karen was fantastic. She's a very collaborative instrumentalist. This is the second violin concerto that I've written, which is kind of crazy since I'm so young. But the first was for Anthony Marwood, a wonderful British violinist, and he was very much like, you know, like the score is, you know, I'm gonna do like an or text reading of the score, and I'm not going to talk to Sam at all until maybe the second rehearsal or something. And Karen was very collaborative. You know, we talked a lot about the pieces as I developed it, and yeah, just everything really worked. And I was really happy with that concert and the piece, and it was a good experience. It was a good way to end.
Speaking about coolness of composer, how afraid are you to make your composer notes to figures like Michael Tilson Thomas or Esa-Pekka Salonen? If you are sat there in the audience and you want to say something, do you do it? Or?
Yeah, with Michael and Esa-Pekka, it's fine. You mean you're talking about during the rehearsal process?
Yeah. As a composer,
yeah.
When you see your piece rehearsed, yeah.
Yeah, no, they're totally fine with it. There have been other instances with other conductors who will remain nameless, where that's like not a possibility. You know, like once you've delivered the score, like that's it. Too bad. Like you don't have any agency to say anything more. You are just like, you know, it's basically as if you're dead. You know, you may as well be. You know, I mean, there is something kind of incredible about that approach as well, which is, yeah, like that. Your score might be treated with the same kind of. How do I want to phrase this? Well, I'll just put it this way. Put it very simply,
maybe
that your score would be that your score would be treated the same. Beethoven scores would be treated that like everything is on the page, and you know all the decisions that are relevant are the ones made, and not the ones that could be possibly made before the premiere. So yeah. But again, MTT specifically, since they're both composers, like, I mean, they want to hear from me. They want to know my thoughts about what works and what doesn't work. So they're collaborators.
You have this specific element in many of your works that are amplified sounds that you yourself regulate through a laptop. So you become your own sound engineer. So my question is, Can you describe to us what are you intending with this amplification and what difference of sound does it bring to your works?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, how shall I answer this question? Um, I think it's, well, I'll frame it like this, which is that I think a lot about, I think a lot about music. I think a lot about notes and rhythms. But I think what's an important question for me to ask myself consistently is the question really of how we consume music as people in the 21st century, um, and what specifically about the modes of transmission, shall we say, affect the sonic world that we inhabit on a daily basis. Um, and so, like specifically, when you think about listening to music on your iPhone or in your car or something, which is probably how most people consume their their music. I mean, we obviously we still go to the concert halls occasionally, but really, you know, the way that most of us listen to music is through some kind of digital medium. Um, that actually has a profound effect on the amount of noise and digital artifacts that uh, are present when listening to like a piece of classical music that's been compressed because it has to go onto YouTube and it has to somehow be communicated like on a really terrible Wi-Fi signal or something. Um, and to me, the 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 products of like digitization are really interesting, and I think that those kinds of sounds and those kinds of um, like uh, glitches and sonic images absolutely should become part of at least my work. I wouldn't want to tell other composers how they should write, but I think this is certainly an aspect of our like sonic consciousness that absolutely deserves to be part of the question when thinking about composition and performance. And uh, it's also a tricky thing to do when you're dealing with live musicians on the stage, because if you are going to incorporate digital elements into a live performance, ever render like a human being and the thousands of hours that they've spent perfecting, you know, a vibrato on their violin, you don't want to render that irrelevant or obsolete somehow. And so a lot of what I do with the computer is I'll amplify the organic sound, the acoustic sound that's on the stage, and then ever so slightly manipulate it to bring out like certain harmonies that might not necessarily be present without amplification. Or I might use like a certain computer program to capture certain resonances in non-pitched instruments, for example, like percussion or like snare drums, like instruments that create a lot of white noise. Um, I mean, to say exactly like why I do this on an aesthetic level, that's kind of hard for me to say honestly. It's like it's just a kind of sound world that I'm very attracted to as a person. So it's much more of an intuitive decision, you know, like I don't have some like grand scheme that I feel like I'm part of necessarily making these decisions. um yeah, and it's interesting that you asked this question, but also the fact that you articulated that it's a subtle process. I've been thinking a lot about what this means to transform sound in a way that's invisible. And up until now, with all my works, the digital like literally behind the audio. I'm the person the furthest like back part of the house, and I've been thinking more about what it might mean to like visualize or corporealize, to use a fancy word, I'm sorry, to visualize the actual process of transforming sound. And there are a lot of composers who are really good at this. Like I'm thinking specifically of laptop performers like Sam Pluta, who's a composer. I guess he's based in Chicago now. but like he's a wild computer nerd genius type composer, and he programs all of his software himself, and he goes on stage with the musicians, with mostly improvising musicians, and transforms their sound live, which has been really inspiring to me. And I've been thinking about, actually with the piece that I'm writing currently, how I might find ways to physicalize the transformation. It's like, it's kind of a dumb example, but people are really into like looping musicians, who will play something on their trombone or their guitar or whatever, and then like literally press a pedal, then you hear that thing again, and then you play on top of that, and then you press the pedal again, and then you hear that thing, and it's like, oh, I get it. Like, I see what's happening. This is a digital transformation, but I get it because like this musician's foot is moving and is stepping on something, like it's why we go on stage and perform, because there's a visual element that's really incredible, and that's like absolutely essential to the understanding of how sound is actually produced. So with the piece that I'm writing right now, which is another work for the Australian Chamber Orchestra, it's an electric violin concerto, which is kind of a very interesting task, I must say. I can't say that I'm a huge fan of the sound of the electric violin, but I actually really like the challenge of dealing with something that's so kind of unusual, and that doesn't have like a massive tradition necessarily to think about. And so with this piece, I've really been considering ways in which I can have the other musicians in the ensemble like transform the sound of the violin like on stage, like with certain types of technologies, like either through like harmonizing or vocoding or I don't know exactly what conclusions I'll arrive at, but I can say that it's really important for me at this point to like make those transformations a little bit more clear to the audience.
I'm really impressed that you brought that up, because I wanted to ask, in your work, Movements for Us and Them, it seems that you also tried to score the relationship between conductor, orchestra, musicians of the chamber orchestra and the audience. And my question was, how can you score the interaction of musicians inside a piece? I thought that it was impossible. Like, they just interact as they choose, but you seem to have been focusing on their interactions in this piece. No?
Yeah, I mean, that piece is a concerto grosso. And so I think that I was interested in the idea of getting rid of the typical balance of a concerto where you have one person against a lot of people. And I've written several concertos like that before, but with this piece in specific, I think I was interested in having two ensembles that kind of were like somehow democratically balanced, but beyond that, like whose roles could also fluidly change over the course of the piece. And yeah, so I was very much thinking about like how the core musical material could like shift between the groups. And I was also thinking about like how that would manifest visually as well. So a lot of the decisions about material in that piece were not just like sonic decisions, but were like very clear decisions about like what their bows would look like playing certain gestures.
And you put that on paper in your piece? And you
I mean, I didn't write like, no, I like all the physical gestures are implicit in the notational decisions. Like I didn't write in the score like wave your bow in the air or something, which composers will do. And I didn't tell them to move around on stage necessarily, but I did really think about like what certain gestures would look like, like if I had all violinists like whipping their bows, and then all of a sudden if that like specific kind of polyphony were to switch all of a sudden to the concertino rather than the ripieno, like what that would actually look like. And this way of thinking, I think, also is a product of spending a lot of time working with dancers. which has been something that I've been very focused on for like the last 5-6 years or something. And yeah, I've just been thinking a lot more about how to kind of like make use spatially of the stage, even if I don't have musicians like literally moving around, like how to create kind of like physical movement with the players. I thought about this quite a lot with the last string quartet that I wrote for a group called Spectral Quartet, based in Chicago. With the first movement of that work, the physical gestures of their bows on the string, like those decisions were made before I made any decisions about pitch or rhythm, which is kind of interesting, to start a piece with that first, because I'm the kind of composer, usually I'll go to a piano and like hammer things out, but with that piece I was like, what is this going to look like? Mm-hmm. And then what is this going to sound like?
Mm-hmm. It is probably the same work you that went in your mind when you wrote a Lyra, the piece that I was really impressed to see that it is intended for an evening of dance. It is almost like, I went to Max Richter's Sleep. It is a piece intended for sleep. And your piece is a piece intended for dance. And also I was interested to see that it involves a spatial app. Could you describe what this a new technology is doing in your piece?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked, because I just had a conversation with all the dancers and the choreographers and the musicians last night. And now it's a huge question mark for us as to what the piece will be in the next couple of years. It was supposed to premiere in 2 months, and obviously that's not a possibility. So it may have to wait a couple more years. So we're thinking about ways in which we can like completely re-envision it for quarantine. But yes, the piece is the outgrowth of a long-standing relationship with two companies based in San Francisco. One is called Post Ballet, which is a contemporary dance company. They're very collaborative in all the work they do, as well as a group called the Living Earth Show, which is a duo, percussion and electric guitar, with the addition of electronics, if that's what the composers feel like they want to do. And we've been making together. We've been making music together since 2010. The first piece that I wrote when I finished school was actually for this group, the Living Earth Show, and then I wrote a piece for Post Ballet, I think 2 or 3 years later. And it's kind of like my home-based community. Like when I think about the musicians and the artists in the Bay Area that are closest to me, it's really these people. Mm-hmm. And 3 years ago, we decided that we wanted to create an evening length work together. And that we also wanted to use a kind of existing framework or an existing text, and that we wanted the piece to somehow be like very immersive in a sense. And in thinking about what the piece could possibly be and what kinds of texts we might want to either commission or include in some way. And when I say text, I don't necessarily mean like words that will be part of the piece, but just kind of like existing narratives. We decided that it would be interesting to do an Orpheus and Eurydice incarnation of sorts. Mm-hmm. I think it was like, I listened to I think it was the Emmanuel Haim L'Orfeo. And it was like at that moment that I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. And so much of that piece, so much of that music has a kind of spatiality built into it. When you think of like the really famous arias like Posente Spirito, in the, I think it's the third act when Orpheus is playing his lyre to Charon, you hear in the score a kind of like implicit resonance. You know, the violins play a melody and then you hear them again in the distance, you know, a la Symphonie Fantastique, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, it was at this exact time that I had a conversation with Helen Meyer, who's in charge of Meyer Sound, which is a internationally renowned sound production company. You know, they do primarily like big corporate events and whatnot, but Helen and her partner John, who's the lead technician of the company, are very invested in the Bay Area artistic community. And she had literally just told me about a technology that they were working on called SpaceMap Live, which enables you to create like a full kind of ambisonic spectrum. But beyond that, to also kind of articulate different acoustic spaces to make the interior of a concert hall feel as small as a shoebox or as big as, you know, Notre Dame or whatever. But beyond this, I mean, ambisonic technology has been around for decades. But what's interesting about SpaceMap Live is the live component, which means that you can actually like move the sound around very, very flexibly, like by just like touching your fingers to iPads, or you could like, you know, put sensors on the dancers and then have the sound follow the dancers as they cut the space. And there are all kinds of really interesting possibilities. And I thought that it would be interesting to kind of explore the spatial aspects of the Orpheus narrative using this technology. And it was like a good justification because, you know, when she first told me about, when Helen first told me about SpaceMap, it was like, yeah, I really want to use this, but I want to make sure that there's some kind of like musical and artistic necessity to use the technology, because there's nothing worse than like seeing a piece that uses fancy technology, but in a way that doesn't really matter, you know? Yeah, the piece is currently, I don't want to say on hold because we're still working to find ways to put it out into ether. And I'll record the music with the two musicians this summer. So most likely what will happen is we'll put out a record first and then a series of smaller videos, and then hopefully in 2021 or 22, most likely 22, we'll do a live performance. But, you know, it's a big question mark, like many other things in our lives now.
Could you talk a bit about if it's happening, your future composer in residence position at the Netherlands?
Right.
With the Netherlands Orchestra. I understand that it's your first immersion into the European musical life, right? In a way, no?
Yes. My first immersion. I mean, I've had pieces performed in Europe, but this will be the first time that, you know, I'll really be like meaningfully involved, which I'm really excited about. You know, I think, you know, I love making work in America, but I think it'll be really fascinating to see how things are done, you know, elsewhere. And so, yeah, the residency is with the Concertgebouw, not with the Concertgebouw Orchestra, but the hall. And they'll be presenting 3 of my pieces, a recent string quartet that I mentioned about 10 minutes ago to you, which will be done with the Alma Quartet, and the chamber concerto, which we also talked about, will be done with Asko Schoenberg, as part of a series that they have at the Concertgebouw, but also at the Musikgebouw Eindhoven, called, I'm not going to try to pronounce it in Dutch, or I will, and I will apologize in advance, but it's Scherpdenkers, which means sharp thinkers. And the idea of the concert series is they pair musicians with public intellectuals, and they're fairly short programs, but there will be, you know, 40 minutes of music and maybe 20 minutes of some kind of discussion. And they decided to pair the chamber concerto as well as Shaker Loops by my father, which is a very early string ensemble piece of his, with the political television broadcaster who covers American electoral politics. So it's going to be by leaps and bounds like the most politically thing I guess I've ever done. I mean, I'm not going to be the person on stage opining about the 2020 election. But certainly like the inclusion of my music in that kind of dialogue should be interesting. I mean, if it happens, I think there is a very good chance that uh, concerts in the fall will be postponed if the coronavirus comes roaring back.
Do you think that you might use this time to go to other European capitals to listen to the music, to new music scenes there?
Yes,
Or
definitely.
are you planning to stay in Europe?
I'm a little embarrassed to say that
Yeah.
Oh, it's a 3-month period, and they're keeping me fairly busy in Amsterdam. But I mean, I've never been to Berlin, which is ridiculous. So I'd love to go spend some time there, and I'd love to go to Eastern Europe. You know, I'd love to go to Russia.
Well,
I'd also love
please come.
I'd love to spend some time in Scandinavia as well. You know, I'm really I love Nordic composers, and I think it'd be really fascinating to go up to Helsinki and Copenhagen just to see what it's like up there. So I'm really looking forward to having an extended period in Europe.
Well, I want to ask to sort of to fly back where you are, and well, we all know that the San Francisco Symphony is going to have the new music director, whom we talked about already, Esa-Pekka Salonen, and I was wondering whether you think that his involvement with new music would somehow touch upon the life of yourself and of other new composers in the area. How do you envision the possible new connection?
Yeah, I think everyone is really excited about his arrival in the Bay Area for a number of reasons. You know, it's no secret that the Bay Area is a very, very expensive place to live, and it's not, you know, it's very difficult for artists to you know, make a way in it's so dominated by tech and Google and Facebook and like insane housing prices. And so I think that, I'm not to say that he's going to come and like a bunch of artists are going to flock to the Bay Area, but I think that his arrival and the program that he'll be involved in will bring a certain kind of attention to the Bay Area that we may not have really had in the last 10 years or so. You know, it's not to say that like NTT didn't do really important, amazing programming, but it's always exciting to have just a little bit, you know, of like fresh set of new ideas. But the other thing about Esa-Pekka is that he's a tech guy, you know, like he was on an Apple commercial at some point, and he's, you know, he's really interested in the ways that music and technology can interact somehow. And, you know, I can say this having lived most of my life in the Bay Area, which is that there's like this weird disconnect between the tech community and the music community, which is strange because I think people in the tech community, many of them view themselves as creative individuals, that what they're doing is, you know, like creating modes of communication. And that's fundamentally what I do as a composer. I'm creating like ways to communicate. So you'd think that there would be this like really deeply enriched dialogue, but it somehow like doesn't really exist. Honestly, the best like incubator for tech and the arts really is Burning Man, which is this yearly festival that happens out in the desert in Nevada. And so there are a lot of artists who have really kind of like straddled both of those lines. But yeah, I think that Esa-Pekka like is ready to meaningfully engage that community in really interesting ways. So much so that he even hired a roboticist to be part of a creative team. I forget what he calls them. They're like the think tank, or oh no, they're called the Brain Trust. He hired 6 or 8 musicians of like different backgrounds and disciplines, whatever. And the one non-musician is this young woman named Carol Riley, who's a roboticist. And so I guess she's going to be part of like the artistic decision-making process, which is fascinating. So I think we're all really curious to see like what that will be, you know.
Could you envision like the practical results of tech and music collaboration without losing the music element in the process? Because if it all becomes about VR experiences, then it's not what we want with contemporary music to happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's cool because, you know, I think a lot of folks in tech would like to believe that everything that they're doing is for the good of our species. And of course, there's, you know, there are incredible benefits to the you know, inventions of the last decade. Even, you know, like we're having a conversation right now, and this is wonderful, and that's thanks to Instagram and the folks at Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, et cetera. But you know, there are downsides as well, and I think that like artists can't help but be critics when involving some kind of like non-musical element into their work. So it would be really interesting to see like collaborations between you know, composers and the tech community that were like critical and asked really meaningful connections, meaningful questions about the use of technology, without like alienating those who are actually in charge of developing those specific technologies. That's kind of like a convoluted answer to your question. I can't say exactly what that might end up looking like.
I was asking because, you know, I kind of feel that sometimes the perception that two of these areas require from us are working at a bit of a counter purpose, because you mentioned that music is a temporal art, while I think many tech things require your attention within a minimal span of time and then maybe to switch somewhere else. So
right.
do you think that our adaptation to all these new technologies, which requires clicks and quick movements of eyes, would lead to us losing the ability to concentrate, say, on a Mahler symphony or even on a 30 minutes cembalo concerto?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is that possibility, but yeah, it's very interesting. I was actually thinking about this yesterday, about like how to respond to a certain kind of predicament, and specifically with respect to tech. Like the piece that I'm writing right now is very much like, it feels like a radical break for me in the sense that I want to create something that requires focus and that has nothing to do with the culture of like fractured information and like clickbait and ADD psychosis, whatever. But there certainly are a lot of composers and a lot of artists who want to bring that kind of fundamental way in which our brains have changed into the form of the music itself. I'm thinking of a composer like Andrew Norman, for example, a great American orchestral composer who's found ways to like bring in the scattered non-linear way that we engage with information while also maintaining like big like symphonic architectures. Like he has this piece Play, which is a really one of the best orchestral pieces of the last decade, in my opinion, that like if you zoom out and looked at the form of the piece in a very kind of low res way, looks the same as like a Mahler symphony or a Tchaikovsky symphony. But when you actually like zoom up and look at the way in which he's handling material, the piece is non-linear, and there are all these like fragments of musical information that at first have nothing to do with one another and then gradually coalesce over the progression of the work. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question that you ask, because it really, I suppose, depends on like how much you want to ignore that part of our lives and how much you want to go against the grain, or how much you want to like bring that into the forefront of the conversation vis-a-vis your work.
I think we have to stop here because it's only 30 seconds left.
Oh, geez, that's by really fast.
Yeah, well, we can do another 10 minutes afterwards, but now it will stop, unfortunately. Well,
Oh,
we'll
okay.
decide now. So I'm saying hi from St. Petersburg, and we could continue if I restart the whole thing, like maybe for 10 minutes more if you want.